Hi, everyone. Bobby from the Savory Institute here. I am privileged to have Lee Frankel-Goldwater from CU Boulder and Abbey Kingdon-Smith of the Savory Institute here with me today to talk about a new white paper that they have just written and released called Network Leadership and Practice, a multi-year retrospective on lessons from the Savory Global Network. So, Abbey, Lee, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Bobby. It's awesome to be here and be at this point to discuss this work.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
it's been incredible to watch the evolution and the work that has gone on to culminate in this white paper. I know it's been a labor of love for many years for both of you. So, why don't we start off with some introductions? Let's introduce ourselves. I mentioned I'm Bobby with the Savory Institute. Lee, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lee. I am a currently finishing up PhD student at the University of Colorado in Boulder and living here in Boulder and studying food systems and network collaboration as my focus.
All right. Abbey?
Awesome. My name is Abbey Kingdon-Smith, and I am the Savory Global Network Coordinator. I live in Fort Bidwell, California, and I work remotely for the Savory Institute. One thing I wanted to say about Fort Bidwell is it is a place of convergence. So if you look at it in an ecoregion sense, it's where two ecoregions come together. And if you look at tribal lands, it's where many tribes came together. And so I think there's this boundary walking work that I'm doing in my life. And that term I actually learned from Lee because that really applies to network coordination.
Well, I had other questions, but now I'm curious boundary walking. Lee, would you like to describe what boundary walking is?
Yeah, sure. It's you can think about places and locations as being like distinct sites of action, but also within an organization, the roles that we play in those groups of being different sites of action. And if you think of those as almost like spheres interacting with each other in a sauce of social and physical dynamic, we often in our job roles or our life roles sit in that one position. We've been taught to stay in that one kind of box and act from there. But the boundary walkers are the ones who will take a step back and look at the interconnections between these areas, these sites of action, socially and physically, and say, I'm going to be able to move between them and also communicate across them. Like you might talk with a rancher in California differently than you talk to a rancher in South Africa. And not only linguistically, but the way that the world meets them is different. Different to how you might talk with a policymaker or a network leader. And the boundary walker is one who can sit in all those places and seem like at least half one of the folks, if not one of the folks, and knows the vocabulary and language and knows how to translate between these sites. So that boundary walker really helps connect the dots between these kind of very seemingly disconnected spheres.
Yeah. So in that regard, my understanding is you've been a boundary walker for the last 6 years following along the work of the Savory Global Network. Would you say that's accurate?
Thanks. I've tried my best to. I've often been reminded by folks that I'm there. They like me. They think I'm cute and funny, but I'm not a rancher. And but they I think they've seen me generally, as like part of the group because they'll also understand that everyone is so different. So then I'll put on my academic hat. I'll put on my kind of practitioner, let's solve a problem hat. I'll put on my kind of community researcher hat, or just my guy from the Bronx on a ranch hat. So I've done my best to. I hope I've succeeded.
Yeah. I've been at a lot of those meetings, or at least some of them. It seems like anytime I would show up at a training anywhere around the world, you happen to find yourself at those. And it was always a pleasant surprise to see you there. Maybe we should take a step back, though, and I feel like we jumped right into the meat of it because I was interested in that term boundary walker. But maybe we should define the word network. This is a white paper about network leadership. And Lee, you're a researcher that studies networks. So what do we mean when we say network, and how does that differ from, say, an organization?
Yeah, very much. I think one thing to keep in mind is like network is such a broad general term and it can apply to so many things. And so I generally think of a network as some kind of distributed group of social connection. But that's really high level and broad because you can have all kinds of networks. We all have social networks where we're tagging posts and pictures. We have research networks where we're sharing information. We have our kind of local community networks where, let's say somebody I know if I'm sick, someone can bring me groceries. Like that's a kind of a network. I think in this context, we're talking about a very specific type of network, which is called a transboundary action network. And in breaking each of those words apart, transboundary meaning, across boundaries. And those boundaries could be social, structural, or physical, like within an organization or within location, time, and space. But action is that we're focused on doing something. So here with the Savory Global Network, there's folks are training up in holistic management and are coming together to create wide-scale social change together. But people are making products and doing things. And so that's part of the action. The action is practicing holistic management and creating global social and environmental shift. So I'd say a social configuration that is taking action across wide regions of time and space is the kind of network we're talking about here. And I would call that a transboundary action network.
I've never heard that term before, but I love it. I wrote it down because, I do marketing and communication. So I'm like, yeah, make a note of that one.
And to be fair, there's a lot of other terms that could be used that would accurately describe Savory Global. That's just one phrase that captures some stuff I've also really very much enjoyed. I'm blanking on the term. It'll come to me, but other really good terms that are out there to describe these things.
I'm sure there are. Well, so how did you get involved studying networks in the first place? Like, what drew you to it?
So, yeah, when it leads me to thinking way back to what inspired me to participate in the environmental movement. And growing up in the 90s, the line think local, act, or think global, act local was so big, was like the big take up line. And it's interesting that that's not quite as popular anymore because now we think about think global, act global, or think local, act local, but I was always enamored with that idea that local actions somehow could be part of or influence the global scale of change. And over time, growing up professionally, I wasn't really seeing that happening. I would see a lot of local action and a lot of global thinking, but wouldn't often see them come together. And then I'd see big things like UN accords or big companies or nonprofits doing things, and something always seemed missing. And when I started discovering these concepts of networks and collective action, of seeing how across time and space we can coordinate together to create shifts, I was saying that's it. That's the real linchpin between thinking globally and acting locally. And that maybe that could help galvanize the social change and the global change that we really seek, because it's not really being done as much as it could be and perhaps should be. So I got really interested in doing that when I decided to go pursue a PhD, because if I'm going to stick my nose in books for years, at least let it be about something meaningful.
Yeah, that's great. And so that's more on the academic side. There's the two of you here on this white paper. So, Lee has defined networks. Abby, how would you define specifically the Savory Global Network, which is what this white paper dives into and what you lead?
Yeah, I think just like Lee did, I wanted to back up to a sentient moment for me in realizing what a network was, and it was actually through a workshop that Lee and another professor from Colorado, CU Boulder, had invited me to, And they were talking about networks, and they were saying that networks are actually it's a redistribution of power. So it's confronting established power structures, because we're going from a top-down, very hierarchical power. If you think of where power is accumulated and held in a society, in a system, and we're saying take it from a small amount of people at the top of a hierarchical system, flatten that system, and distribute the power in terms of decision making and action. And I was blown away, because I never saw myself as an activist or a rebel or anything like that. I was a mom who needed to build a beautiful world for her children. And I thought, oh my goodness, what am I doing? I'm this like rebel activist that's going to tear down existing power structures and redistribute them to everyone. And I kind of loved that in a way. And for me, it's about grassroots movement. It's about nodal structures. It's about regenerative design and being in it together. So I don't have a beautiful, clean, crisp definition, but to me, it's the spirit of being in it together. And we believe that we're better together, and so we unite and share information, and we grow together. Versus, I can do it myself. I'm on my own. I know everything. I'm fine by myself. That's not a posture or attitude that you'd often find in a network.
And so specifically, how does that translate to the Savory Institute's work? I think a lot of people know us at the Savory Institute for holistic planned grazing and how we help farmers and ranchers and pastoralists regenerate grasslands. But that Savory Global Network is a very critical piece to how that work is spread. So
yeah, absolutely. When I talk about this with the network and with people who are interested in the network, there's a story, and there's a really important origin story to that, and the decision to form a network. But the summary of it is that holistic management had been around, and the founders of the Savory Institute were wondering, why wasn't it more adopted? Why hasn't it been taken up? And so they looked at places in the world where it had, and they noticed certain organizational structures, the way people were working together. And they realized, man, in order to really scale this on a global level, we need to design a completely different structure to get this done. The existing organizational structures are not going to work. So the idea of a network, of a grassroots movement working with people, led by people who are closest to the land, came into being, and it became this grand experiment. So holistic management is our language. I was going to say the practice, but it's more than a practice. It's a whole way of living that unites us. But we are together working toward this change, and we kind of gestured toward that, saying that we're an action network. We're not just talking about this, we're doing it, and we're sharing our findings with each other. Did that answer your question, Bobby?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
And how did you come to find yourself coordinating this global network? And, kind of like, what's your role within the network? Because the network is comprised of these Savory hubs that are all around the world, and they all look different from one another, and they're independently owned and independently operated. And you have a specific role within that as the global network coordinator. So, what is that role, and what are you responsible for, and how do you see yourself in that position?
Yeah, I didn't even really know what I was doing when I came into it, to tell you the truth. So I've had to evolve and come to discover that. It's been a very emergent process. For me, the origin of it was I had studied holistic management in Africa when I was in my 20s. I came back to the States. I couldn't find any way to plug that in on a professional level. So I experienced what the Savory Institute founders had expressed, that it's not scaling. There's not these networks. There's not these communities broadly practicing and sharing together. And then when the Savory Institute was founded and I learned about it, I thought, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for, because now we're taking these great concepts and this practice that was life-changing for me, and we're trying to make it relevant for everyone. When I felt like prior to the Savory Institute, holistic management was something that a couple large landowners in like arid New Mexico and Texas and maybe parts of Southern Africa and Argentina did. It wasn't what everyone did. There was no role for consumers. It was this very, very focused thing for specific people on a specific land type. And I didn't believe that was true. And so when I saw what the Savory Institute was doing, I thought I had to be part of this. And I didn't realize how early it was. I just knew it had to be done. And it was very, very early in the network. So I first joined as a hub leader and learned about what a hub meant and what a hub did in its own specific region of the world, and then what it was like to be part of the network. And the more involved I got, the more I was convinced that this is the work that I need to be doing, and this is what is going to make the change. And it was actually, I mean, this is as crazy as it is. I was actually in a meditation that I thought there needs to be a network coordinator. There needs to be someone in this network that's holding space for that, that layer, that viewpoint of all the connections. And I actually pitched that to Trey and Daniela, who are the lead team, the founding team of the Savory Institute. And they're like, well, that sounds great. Why don't you write a job description for it? So I wrote the job description, then I applied for my job, and then I, thank goodness, got the job. Someone else could have. There's amazingly talented people in our network, but
how great would it have been if you wrote your own job description, pitched it, and they were like, sorry, we decided to go with someone else.
Yeah, and I actually did have that fear because a lot of people applied. I'm like, oh dear, but whatever. As long as the work was being done that needed to be done, great, like that's fine. But I just felt like it was so intuitive and so deep. It was this deep yes that I knew I needed to do this work. So, but again, that role evolved over time. But my idea or my vision in those early days of the network coordinator is someone who made sure all the stuff got done. They say that coordination and activism work is 90% follow-up, and everyone was so busy. All these hub leaders are so busy, like running farms and being activists in their own communities and training and doing all these things. Like there needs to be someone that's keeping watch and nurturing and holding these connections and these spaces for us to come together and making sure that gets done, especially in those early days when it's young and new. And I still have the vision that someday my role won't even be needed and that we all are self-organizing and it's great. And I will celebrate that day. That's where it's coming from for me.
Yeah. And there's that piece you mentioned of being nurturing and providing space for the work to be done. And I think of that in contrast to like a traditional organization where it's control. It's a top-down aspect of control, saying you must do this, you have to do this, go do this. But there's no control in living systems. There's influence and there's holding space and nurturing, like you said, and then the outcomes emerge from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can remember I think Lee, you were with me. I mean, you've been with me in so many of these network events and moments, but it was in Gunnison, and the group was so strong. We used to have our hub trainings in Gunnison, Colorado, and I just had this feeling like all I need to do is step out of the way. Like the people in this room they just need to meet each other, and everything's going to be fine. I don't need to. And it was the most. I think I even cried because I was so relieved. Like finally, oh, it's happening. It's really happening. And yeah, I think you're right. It's about just bringing the right people together at the right time in the right way. And there's an art to that as much as a science. And I think there's a lot of intuitiveness that goes with it.
Yeah, for sure. And Lee, I imagine that's probably the type of stuff that you've been looking at as you've been shadowing the network for the last 6 years. So, while most people in the room say you're at a training where hubs are learning how to be savory hubs and they're learning holistic management or they're learning EOV or whatever it might be. And the discussion is around grazing and grasslands and soil health and animal impact and recovery periods and all that great stuff. You're probably looking at things through a slightly different lens as a network researcher. So I'd love to know what it's been like to be a fly on the wall in these conversations, and specifically what sorts of things were you paying attention to?
Was that what was I paying attention to?
Just what kind of things were
All
you
kind of
paying
things.
attention
Yeah, yeah,
to as
totally.
you were a fly on the wall?
Totally, yeah. The it's a it's a great question. I was thinking about it as you were talking, Abby, relative to the getting out of the way. And one of the things I was looking at a lot is there's an idea called net weaving, like a network weaver. And how do you draw these networks together? And really looking at the ways that leadership is trying to create the space for network members to be autonomous in their decision making. So, for example, I'd be really keen at looking at moments of conflict are actually super interesting, or disagreement. Were super interesting to see what were the power dynamics going on. Did network members behave more like employees under the thumb of someone who can punish them if they speak up, or were they feeling boldly able to state their opinions? And it was almost uniformly the latter, where people felt saying, I'm more of a representative. I even remember being at an event at White Oak Pastures where there was some really important stuff being talked about with the future of EOV, and seeing this it was tense in the sense of there were a lot of people with a lot of different opinions and perspectives. And I remember in my notes, as you're talking about, being this kind of like observer in the room, of comparing it with what it might have been like at like the Constitutional Congress, in the founding of the U.S., of people arguing about different things and different uh, states or early states having their own desires and perspectives and skin in the game of what they were seeing mattered to them because of their context, and seeing how that was coming together of people talking about these different needs and desires, and some people being willing to walk and saying like, I'm not doing the program if it's this. And it's just like, well, that's not what we want. And so this kind of collaborative effort to create agreement that affects the network, that affects people's livelihoods, that affects the movement, participation in the movement, and just the way that these things are navigated. And for example, in that moment, I found it must have been at least half a dozen times that people had said, let's come back to our context, to our holistic context as a network. And having that shared vocabulary of speaking together, even though being in tension and potential disagreement, to have a shared point of commonality coming back to. That's something that the network provided them, that gave a tool for navigating conflict through a point of commonality, was the kind of thing I would observe and look at. So I was always looking at these kind of like, what is the bigger dynamics going on? How does passion and inspiration lead into things? Seeing folks come from all across the world where they're the only ones doing what they do in their location, and often feeling this sense of belonging in the network gathering, seeing their people in a way, but with speaking English is a shared language, but a lot of time half the people their English was a second language for them, and they're in different contexts. One is trying to do community agriculture work in parts of Europe or in Africa, and others are more in the commercial supply chain side here in the States. And yet there's all seeing each other as each other's people or as commonality. Like how does that even happen? That's the dream. That's my dream, at least. I don't want to project what anyone else's dream or should be. But that idea that people are coming together for collective action, where they basically have nothing in common except that they want to like raise animals and either eat them or sell them or both. And like that's about it. And generally make things better by doing so. So I'm looking at the dynamics of what's drawing people together or pulling them apart. What are the leadership dynamics that are holding that together? What are the struggles? What are the growth points? So I was afforded that opportunity to take a step back from the nitty gritty of what does it mean to know my grass? What are the feed allowances in EOV? And to be like, what's the bigger picture that's going on? So those are the kind of things.
Yeah, it's super fascinating, and for folks watching, that's exactly what this white paper dives into is how the network operates and what the findings were and the outcome of this work is there were 5 key themes that you guys identified, and I'd like to get into those themes. But Lee, while you were talking about the things that you were paying attention to and looking at, I couldn't help but wonder if there were any moments that surprised you, or um, assumptions maybe that you carried into your um, studies of the network that maybe you had to readjust, based on your observations and spending time.
Totally. I the I think all of the themes in those points I just shared relate
Mm-hmm.
very much to these. Oh, that's awesome. That's a surprise. Or in the seeing just how these dynamics work in the room were super powerful and valuable. But the one that really came to mind that I I stayed with some like I don't know for sure, but I know that I saw this and I was really amazed was when I got to meet Alan Savory at one of the White House gatherings. And here I am, I'm like, a relative outsider, insider, outsider. And I'm appreciative of holistic management. I hadn't used it on the land. I had done a holistic management training. I hadn't seen it work on the ground. And I was more familiar with this bigger scale debate of does it work? You get certain ecologists saying yes, certain ecologists saying no, certain people slamming it, certain people loving it. Driving to, I forget, was this a what? I don't even, I've been to so many, I'm losing where it was. I was driving in the car with a gentleman named Pablo, telling about, and him explaining to me that interface of just the on the ground experience versus what's getting written about in some ways, and how these things don't match up. And in being a good, scientist, I'm trying to say I'm not allowed to make judgment there. I can't pick a side. I'm just receiving the information. And what I had wondered about was is there a bit of a guruship around Alan that's leading people to make certain decisions? And what I remember once, I think it was actually at that same gathering at a different moment, the one where I said the Constitutional Congress thing, where Alan had made suggestions about what the network context should look like. And people stood up and said no. And I was incredibly grateful to see that there was a huge respect for the man, but at least some folks were willing to say, you're a guy with opinions. And that was a great surprise turning point moment for me of realizing that there's a great appreciation for the man and a kind of a there's always the fear that there's a cult of personality with this kind of stuff. And yet saw clear moments that the network itself was able to go beyond just the perceptions of the man who helps get it started. And I didn't know that that would be true because it wouldn't be unique to if it wasn't true, it wouldn't be unique to the Savory Global Network that you have a charismatic leader who drives the whole thought center of what we're doing. And I can't speak to what that looks like relative to holistic management, but relative to the network, I felt people just doing what they really felt and doing and saying what they felt was right in many walks and not just adhering to the Savory Institute's view or Alan Savory's view. I think that was delightfully surprising in some ways.
Yeah. That's super interesting. And, when you think about the holistic management framework, given that it's a decision making framework, that makes a ton of sense because as a decision making framework, it gives agency to every individual to make decisions for what is appropriate for them, rather than saying, no, you just listen to what you are told and you follow orders,
Totally.
or, the traditional hierarchical top down approach, which is the exact opposite of kind of how we operate here at the Savory Institute in our network, and, kind of what holistic management encourages.
And I saw that, and I think that the actual like structure of the network and the way it's led gives those moments for people to be able to speak their mind, which is what allowed me to even have that observation. I feel like if people felt more under the thumb of something, they don't speak up their thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't speak for everyone. I can't speak for those who didn't speak, but the enough people over time that are just saying, no, we do what we do. We want to do it. Or being in the room with all the people and saying, no, here's my opinion. And feeling empowered to do that was like a huge, like, whoa, that's definitive. That's clear, at least from those people. That was really powerful.
Yeah, thanks for that. Let's dive into the 5 themes that you guys identified in the white paper. And I'm trying to think of what the best way for us to do this is. Here, I'll just mention a term from, so the first theme talks about networks helping create a sense of belonging and not being alone. So where's the value of that? How did that arise as a theme, and why is that important?
Do you want me to answer that? Yeah.
Go for it, Abby.
Yeah, I think this is one of my favorite ones because I think as someone who is holding space for the places that we share and we come together, that was really important. And I saw it so strongly that, like we said earlier, people who are practicing holistic management, who are managing holistically in their own lives on their own land, they're usually pretty isolated in their communities. And what I've found in these almost 8 years I've been doing this, that people who are practicing holistic management or managing holistically have usually gone through some massive transformation in their life that led them to discover the body of knowledge or to connect to the community. So they're usually really interesting people, and I don't know if it's that connects us, or I find this familiarity, even if I haven't met them yet. Like we said, they could be from Israel or they could be from Argentina, but there's this like, oh, I know you, like you're one of us, you're part of this family. And it's really interesting to see or to feel that and yet have nothing in common with these people. Literally never met them before. We have different ethnicities, different language, different culture, just different, everything's different. And yet there's this sense of like, oh, these are the people I need to be working with. And there's a sense of family and coming home. And especially during the pandemic, when our world was so unpredictable. I mean, it's always unpredictable, but that was really in our face, that's how things are. This sense of connection was energizing for people. And so if you imagine someone trying to do important work with no support in their geographic area, in their local community, that can be exhausting. Like you literally just don't have the energy to do the work anymore and you get burnt out. But if you can tap into an energy source to continue that work, then things will actually change, things will get done. And so I actually see this as vital to our work, this ability to come together, get energy from those interactions to continue our work in our own communities. And I've experienced that. I've witnessed it and I've experienced it myself.
All right. The second theme is about developing a shared language and identity and how that can support productive connection building, serving as a foundation for navigating conflict. Lee, I know you had mentioned the navigation of conflict earlier, so you want to expound on that one a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. What I found fascinating was that holistic management it's a decision making framework for on the ground practice. A lot of it is around like, where do I move my animals to create abundant grasslands and have this entire process for understanding that. And then there are components that are financial and business oriented, but that it's a very practical on the ground tool. And yet on and on I saw it functioning as this language for cohering people together. And like I had mentioned in an example earlier of the way that in a moment of tension and conflict, people returned to the metaphors from holistic management or the tools from holistic management to draw everyone together. And yes, to talk about practical things, but it was also like a social identity tool, a common language of understanding. And to see that something can be both an on the ground practice action tool and a language for collective shared action was fascinating to me. And this idea that it could be both at once, a network organizing tool that help people come together and have shared language and commonality and be a practice tool at once, which is really, really fascinating.
Now, outside of Savory's work, say someone else who is involved in another type of transboundary action network, because we know there's lots of them out there, I'm going to assume. I don't know. Say they're watching this. What would that shared language and identity look like? In Savory's world, obviously, it's holistic management because that's that decision-making framework that we all use. It's our shared DNA. But can you give us an example of what that might look like in another type of network?
Totally. Many networks have their practice. There are other agriculture networks like Via Campesina or La Via Campesina. There's ones that focus on policy. There are ones that focus on rights of other kind. It could be a whole range of kind of practices out there beyond agriculture, education. And I'd say it's usually easy to identify the practice tool. Let's say in education, it's a curriculum or a particular pedagogy. And you have a network that revolves around that pedagogy practice. But what I'd say is, how can you use that common practice as an effective language for drawing your network together as well and navigating conflict? What does it teach you that can perhaps be used on a social level to help bring in that shared identity? How can you highlight that as a point of commonality that leads into the first theme of, well, that creates a sense of belonging? So it's really looking at how does your day-to-day practice support a language of shared identity, and creatively looking at that, and it'll probably look different in every context.
So the first theme, you create a sense of belonging that gets people together. And then once people are together, the second theme, develop a shared language and identity. And then from there, the third theme is building a community of practice. And the white paper indicates that this can help to support collective action and connections across participants. So you want to dive deeper onto that one?
Sure. Abby, would you like to take that one, trade off?
No, go ahead. It's good. Go for it. I feel like you're on a roll. That's perfect.
Well, similarly, I think that those come together very naturally. Like a community of practice is an idea of like the common example where that term came from was nursing practice. You can get nurses basically all over the world, and they can come together in a room and just have a conversation about their day to day, even though one might be a nurse in China or one could be a nurse in New York. And and it's the most of what they're doing will be very, very similar to where they really understand who each other are. And I think when we're talking about a network like the Savory Global Network, we have the shared language and identity being holistic management. You create these spaces for people to not be alone. And that's a connection alignment. But then the action alignment comes along the community of practice where you're sharing resources together, you're supporting each other in your work. You might be creating actual projects together as well as being cheerleaders. So the community of practice is the one that's the container that helps make those other two purposeful.
Mm-hmm. Abby, what does that community of practice look like, like logistically speaking, from the Savory Global Network perspective? What sorts of structures do you have in place to nurture that community of practice?
Yeah, they really happen on different scales. So there is at the local level, there's typically, in many hubs, there's a producer network that would support each other in their, reviewing grazing plans, looking at financial decisions, helping each other test decisions. And that's actually where the network was modeled after the early management clubs that were formed around holistic management in places like Australia and Southern Africa. And that's where they found that the practice actually took root and transformation happened on the land. So to Lee's point, these communities of practice aren't just people getting together and having a good meal and sharing some laughs. Like, this is what makes the change happen on the land and transform from desertifying land to regenerating land. And so that's more at the local level in these bioregional areas. And then at the global level, we've created structures and tools to put in place where people can gather and share very quickly. So we have a community platform for the Savory Global Network that's really actively used, easy to use. People can share ideas from the books that they're reading to an article that they read to a class that they just gave and things that they learned on how to teach something better. But that ability to share information quickly across the globe, focused on a certain outcome, is really powerful.
Love it. Okay. So I'm going to keep synthesizing these in order because I feel like they build on each other. All right. So first theme, come together, sense of belonging. Second, develop the shared language and identity. Third theme, then from there, a community of practice, which then leads into the fourth theme, which is developing new supply chains for economic revitalization.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to hop in on that one because this was in some ways my favorite. Well, actually, I'd say the shared language and identity was like I was like, oh, that was juicy and enjoyed that as like a favorite. But the most novel one was this new supply chains one because when you when you look at those who are like study network leadership and practice or like deep experience, deep practitioners, some of these other ones they'd be like, oh, that makes intuitive sense. I feel that, I see that. But one that's not really talked about is what are the incentive structures for joining such a network? Like we talk about regenerate all the grasslands, it seems completely altruistic. It's like, okay, an environmental thing, when I have the time, I'll go save the world. What I found incredibly fascinating was looking at how the land to market program, which was, trying to connect producers through the supply chain all the way to consumers. And what flows through that is product and knowledge and education along that way to try to shift the economic structures of the food system. That has both an altruistic and non-altruistic quality. And that through a network change structure that's trying to kind of make parallel across the world, these autonomous rancher actors working together to shift the global food system to regenerate grasslands, that there's always a question like, what's in it for me? Well, you know what? In doing so, we're creating new supply chains, the we being the Savory Global Network, Savory Institute, this collective action group. We're trying to set up whole new supply chains that is having your cake and eating it too, of like, we're going to shift the global system, we're going to accept a bit of the capitalist structures we're in, but we're going to use it to our advantage as best we can. And our advantage being both individual and collective and planetary and all of humanity. And linking a network chain structure parallel with a supply chain system that's looking vertically across the planet from local to global is pretty cool. And the way that is integrated together, that's really novel. And I think of all the contributions of this white paper to novelty, which a lot of, academic science is interested in. What's brand new, totally new about what you're saying? That's not really been talked about. And that's something the Savory Global Network is doing in a way that I haven't seen elsewhere. It doesn't mean it's not happening, but at the scale it's happening, the level of ambition and the actual effort that's being put into making that happen is a pretty special theory of change, of how we get from A to B. And that's what that theme highlights.
It's definitely been a fun journey to be on, to have been here in the early days of Land to Market and now to see it as its own entity. It's been an evolution, and watching the the hubs and the brands and, the Savory Institute team members, there's this process of co-creation, because just like everything that we do, we buck those traditional organizational structures of top down. Hey, a group of consultants in a back room designed this structure and this is the way it's going to be, and everyone go execute. It's been co-creation and collaboration and iteration and evolution every step of the way, and continues to be.
And now it lends how the network structure itself lends to an experimentation space to try these things out. And that's another affordance of this kind of structure and process. That how do you create something new like that? It's not perfect out of the gate, and you need people experimenting with things and learning from each other and trying it. And that, I think that's what that theme highlights.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's move into the fifth and final theme of the paper, which is creating place-specific regional networks as part of a larger action network, and that being a relatively untapped pathway for wide-scale change.
Thanks. Yeah, place-specific regional networks is a really powerful idea that I noticed as I was seeing the Savory Global Network work to support local action and change. Because many hubs during their design lab experience would say, they're saying, here's what I want my hub to look like 1, 10, 20 years from now. And many of them would include these kind of regional food networks where they were making their own kind of mini savory network in the region by allying with other farmers or cooperatives or whatever it might look like. And that many of their approaches were modeling the hub style Savory Global Network model. There are also the discovery and opportunity sessions that Savory Network is running that we're working to pull together efforts in South America or Central America or the United States or Europe or Africa that have more commonality than in the global network, but are, let me rephrase that, hyper locally, they may have a huge amount of difference between places, let's say across Africa or the United States. But when you bring them all together, they have more commonality than, let's say, African hubs might have with the average European or American hub. And so by trying to create regional networks or quasi-local networks, we're trying to tap into a leverage points for change that a hyper-local or a hyper-global kind of activity might not catch and capture. And so there are many hubs and many potential activities that can happen at that middle layer of collective action. And so a real question is, how does a global network or global organization support this kind of regional or quasi-local networks to build on collective action? Because it's a lot of work and there's a lot of skill sets involved in doing that. But it could be one of these leverage points that are tapping into change in ways that other things haven't done before. And if it can be supported at the global level in some way, that could be very interesting. So that you're trying to get this regional collective action that's facilitated, not directed by, but facilitated or supported or nourished and encouraged by a larger scale network like Savory Global Network. So this was more of a forward-looking theme because there are a handful of examples of things that are doing it within the Savory Global Network. And I've not seen, I've seen a handful of attempts in other types of networks of trying to do this, but the best way to do it is still emerging. And this opportunity space within the Savory Global Network, and perhaps for more other kind of global change networks, might be huge, of saying, how do we create middle ground networks too? How do we do a lot of different things going on, but how do we do it well? How do we train for that? So that's what that theme is pointing.
I'm thinking back to that. I don't know if it was a bumper sticker that you had mentioned, but the phrase, that inspired you initially to get into networks of think globally, act locally. And I'm wondering if the third line of that bumper sticker becomes organize regionally, or with place-specific regional networks. That doesn't really roll off the
Listen,
tongue.
everyone, it was said here first. Copyright Bobby Gill of the Savory Institute.
You said it first, Lee. You said it first. All credit, Lee Frankel-Goldwater, CU
Uh,
Boulder.
well, credit to the collective action. I think this is what it's about. If we here, I'm having this kind of academic hat on,
Yeah.
talking with a global network coordinator and people who are doing stuff on the ground. This is
Hmm.
these kind of creative spaces of the boundary walking of when people come together with a shared language, shared
Hmm.
understandings, and the creative potential there. So things like that. That summarizes what I think the potential and power of these action networks are.
Wonderful. Well, I feel like this is probably a good place for us to start to wrap up. Um, you know, what do you hope that folks get out of this white paper? What if there's one thing you could tell someone of why should I take an interest in this? Why should I read this? What was it, 30 some page document? You know, what do you think? Why is this relevant now? Who is this for? Why should people care?
Yeah, I'll start with that. Lee and I both want this to be useful to other net weavers, people who are coordinating networks, who are participating in networks. And like Lee said earlier, when we started this, it truly was a grand experiment. It's a network, like you said, Bobby, is a living system. It's by definition unpredictable and self-organizing. And these are observations that we had, patterns that we recognized, themes that emerged, as we call them. And I feel like if we can accelerate the learnings in the larger network net weaving community, people don't have to relearn what we learned. They can start where we leave off and then keep going and then share back those learnings. And we're contributing to this larger community of, I hope, growing net weavers. Um, for example, I was doing some hub work in my local community, and the office of Kat Taylor came to visit. They are part of Tomcat Ranch, and they do a lot of work in regenerative agriculture and moving towards policies that support regenerative agriculture. And we were talking about networks, and they're trying to build things like that. And I think a lot of people who are thinking in a systems approach way, thinking and designing regeneratively, or realizing that a top-down approach, while it may have some efficiencies and things, is really not the solution we need to really transform our world. And so I see more and more people looking for solutions in this way that are nodal, that are distributed, that are co-created, that are have these feedback loops and intelligence exchange. And so I think there's just a growing need for this conversation, and we want to contribute to it.
Wonderful. Lee, same question to you.
Yeah, I agree completely. And building on that is that under each of these themes, when we describe it, we point at some of the on the ground things that were going on. And I think that a lot of folks who are doing network leadership and practice work, even whether it's in agriculture or not, or whether you're an agricultural person who just wants to know more how this kind of movement can scale, that you'll see mirrors of yourself in your practice as a point of reflection. And that this white paper is not trying to say like we have an answer to the question of how do you do a global network. This is part of a developmental spiral. This is a point of reflection, and that I think there's been a great opportunity to say like, wow, how's this network been growing? What's been working? But more as a way to check in on like how can we continue to grow and do that. So I think it's interesting as we are discovering as a global community of network practitioners and researchers and leaders of how do we do this global change thing with networks, that this paper is a great moment of check-in and reflection of like, how's it going with one grand experiment? What are you learning that maybe can inform my thinking, not as an answer, but as a collaboration? So I'd view this piece as being a collaboration and contribution to trying to solve that question together rather than as an answer.
Hmm. All right. Closing thoughts, Abby. Anything that you'd like to leave folks with?
I just want to say thank you to Lee and to express my deep gratitude for our friendship that has developed over these years of working together. I literally met Lee the week I started in this position, and so he's been with me ever since. And there's the role that he played as advisor and witness to the work, and he explained some of those earlier, being the fly on the wall, and he was seeing things that I couldn't see because I was in it, I was facilitating, I was following up, and I just think it was a great luck, or meant to be, however you want to think of it. But I'm just really grateful that we ended up walking on this journey together, Lee. So thank you.
Yeah, me too. It's amazing just growing professionally in so many ways, and I've learned so much being with the Savory Institute at all and the network at these events, and I've just grown incredibly. And I'm been so grateful to the welcome y'all have offered me and the openness to share your spirit and what you do with me, and to kind of invite me into this path of discovery together. So um, I'm really, really grateful for that. And Bobby for giving us this chance and this moment to reflect on that together. Thank you for holding that space.
Of course, it's my pleasure. It's been a joy to have you participating over the last couple of years. Just like you were a hub or someone joining the network. There was no difference, I think, in anyone's eyes. You're part of the team, and you'll continue to be a part of this global network, I'm sure, long into the future. Well, thank you both for taking the time to chat today. Thank you for taking the time to write this white paper, which is truly fascinating and hopefully incredibly resourceful and impactful for other net weavers out there around the globe. A reminder that the white paper is called Network Leadership and Practice. We will link to the white paper in the comments alongside this video. You can find it at savory.global/network-whitepaper. And with that, I guess, see you guys later.
See you later. Thanks,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.